In 1877, one wage cut on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, starting in a small West Virginia yard, triggered a national breakdown in days. Freight stopped, cities filled the tracks, and the iron empire that ran America's lifelines faced open revolt. Militia lines cracked, depots burned. And when federal troops finally moved, the country learned how close a pay cut could get to war. Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it. The railroads in the 1870s were not just companies. They were the national nervous system. If trains moved, factories ate. If trains stalled, cities choked. After the Panic of 1873, money tightened and freight fell. Rail executives answered the same way again and again. Cut wages, cut crews, push harder. The men on the trains felt every cut in real time. A brakeman's job was physical math. You climb, you run, you couple cars in bad weather. One mistake means crushed fingers or a body under steel. When pay drops, the risk stays. By mid-July 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio announced another wage cut. Not a small trim, enough that crews saw it as the next step toward ruin. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, workers decided the trains would not move. This is the first scene to lock in. A rail yard at night, steam leaking from valves, lantern light on ballast, freight cars sitting heavy, packed with the country's goods, and a line of railroad men standing on the tracks like a gate. They didn't need speeches. They needed a stoppage that could be seen. Engines were uncoupled. Crews refused orders. Dispatchers sent telegrams up the line, and each message sounded more urgent than the last. The company called for force. The governor called out militia. But militias were made of local men, and many refused to shoot neighbors over a pay envelope. Some units wavered, some did nothing. That hesitation mattered more than any chant, because it told the crowd the state might not hold. Then the railroad reached higher. The logic was brutal. If one yard can freeze a main line, the stoppage becomes a national threat. Federal troops were requested, and when soldiers arrive, the dispute stops being labor trouble. It becomes a test of authority. Word spread along the rails faster than anyone could contain. Not through newspapers first, through telegraph wires and crew talk. If Martinsburg can stop trains, why not the next junction? Why not the next city? That's the real engine of 1877. A network that was built to move freight also moved anger. One cut became a signal. One yard became a trigger. By the time the first troops were being talked about in West Virginia, the strike was already bigger than one railroad. It was turning into a chain reaction, and the rails themselves were the fuse. Martinsburg was supposed to be contained. It wasn't. Once trains stopped there, the stoppage rolled down the same line that carried coal and freight. Crews in other yards watched the company's response. They saw threats. They saw militia hesitation. Then they saw the word that changes everything in a labor fight: troops. Along the Baltimore and Ohio, men began refusing to move trains in more places. Cumberland, key junctions, busy yards where a single stalled freight could block the whole schedule. When dispatchers tried to reroute, they ran into the same wall: no crews. Railroad executives framed it as lawlessness. Workers framed it as survival. In the middle were cities that depended on the rails for food, fuel, and paychecks. That's why the strike spread so fast. It wasn't organized. Like an election, it moved like smoke. One crowd hears another crowd want a delay. One yard hears another yard forced a concession. Then the same anger shows up at a different station wearing a different uniform. Baltimore was the hinge. The city was a major rail hub, and the B&O was its lifeline. But Baltimore was also a place with hard memories of economic collapse. When wage cuts hit, they didn't just hit railroad men. They hit entire blocks that lived off rail traffic. When militia units were ordered to protect rail property, they had to march through streets packed with people who saw the railroad as the attacker. Crowds threw stones, tracks were blocked, rail cars were surrounded. A show of force turned into a moving target. Then shots were fired. Once that happened, the strike stopped being a dispute about pay. It became a question of who owns the street. People ran. Others surged forward. More troops were rushed in. Rail yards turned into contested ground, and every new report pulled in more onlookers. The railroads kept pushing the same message up the chain. If the state can't clear the tracks, the federal government must. And the government answered. Soldiers moving into a city is a different kind of signal than militia. It tells workers the company has the state behind it. It tells investors the rail network will be protected. It tells the crowd that the next step is not negotiation, it's suppression. But even with troops, the rails were still vulnerable. A strike didn't need to destroy the whole line. It only needed to jam the bottlenecks, roundhouses, switches, key bridges, yards where freight cars packed together like kindling. By the time Baltimore was burning into national headlines, the strike was no longer only on the B&O. Other lines watched the chaos and faced the same question. Do we cut wages again and risk the same explosion? Or do we hold the line and risk bankruptcy? In that moment, the Iron Empire did what empires do. It chose discipline. And as that discipline tightened, the strike didn't fade. It jumped west to Pittsburgh, into the yards of the Pennsylvania Railroad, into a city where the rails ran through working-class neighborhoods like a fuse laid on the ground. Pittsburgh was where the strike stopped being a stoppage and became a fire. It sat on heavy industry, and the Pennsylvania Railroad ran straight through it. On July 19th, the spark was almost insultingly small. A flagman named Gus Harris refused to work a double-header freight. 2 engines, fewer crews, same danger, less pay. Others joined him fast. The yard jammed. Then the city noticed. Iron mill men and factory hands poured toward the tracks. It didn't feel like railroad workers anymore. It felt like Pittsburgh versus the line. Local police and local guard units hesitated. They were facing neighbors, relatives, the same streets they lived on. So the governor called in guard troops from Philadelphia instead. On July 21st, those outside troops tried to clear the tracks by force. They charged with bayonets. Then the shooting started. Britannica describes as many as 20 deaths in that first eruption. The troops pulled back into a railroad roundhouse. Outside, the crowd didn't disperse. It turned on the rail property itself. Engines, cars, and buildings were set on fire in the yards. Through the next night, gunfire kept trading across the same lines. Another 20 people in the crowd were killed, and 5 guardsmen died too. Now the strike had a body count on both sides, and the city locked up like a machine with sand in its gears. A virtual general strike formed as more workers joined the action. Steel, mines, laborers. The whole place started moving as one. This was the nightmare the railroads feared. Not one yard refusing orders, but a city deciding the rails were the enemy. While Pittsburgh burned, other towns watched and made the same choice. After Pittsburgh, the strike stopped looking like a regional blow-up. It looked like contagion. Telegraph operators clicked the same sentence across the country in different words. Trains aren't moving. Freight is stuck. Crews are refusing. Crowds are gathering. And once a city watches another city burn rail yards in a single night, every mayor, governor, and railroad president understands the same thing. This can reach us before we decide what to call it. On the Baltimore and Ohio side, the man watching this unravel was John W. Garrett, the B&O's president. He'd spent years building routes and credit like an empire. Now his empire had a weak point that didn't show on any map: the workers who physically made the network move. When the stoppages began, the company line hardened fast. No concessions under pressure. Move trains with force if needed. That force was supposed to come from state leaders. In West Virginia, Governor Henry M. Matthews was already learning the lesson Martinsburg had taught. Local militia can refuse. In Maryland, Governor John Lee Carroll faced the same ugly choice in Baltimore. Call troops and risk blood in the streets, or hesitate and let the rails be taken over by crowds. The problem was spreading faster than any one governor could handle, because the railroads were connected. A shut yard in one state didn't just hurt one company. It jammed schedules for other lines, other factories, other cities. The rail network that had stitched the country together was now acting like a single wire carrying the same shock. In Philadelphia, Thomas A. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad was staring at the same reality from a different angle. His line was the most powerful in the region, and Pittsburgh had just shown what happens when you bring in outside troops and the city decides it's at war with the railroad itself. Scott needed order restored, not only for freight, but for the message. If workers learn they can shut down a major road by force of numbers, it won't stop at one wage cut. Then the strike hit places where people expected discipline to hold. Chicago, a city that lived on rail traffic and meat-packing schedules. Thousands of men who weren't railroad employees still drifted toward the yards because rail stoppages meant layoffs everywhere. Mayor Monroe Heath and city leaders faced a street-level reality that didn't fit neat categories. It wasn't a single union with negotiators. It was a crowd with momentum. And a crowd doesn't sign an agreement. This is where the national crisis becomes obvious. Rail executives want troops. Governors want someone else to take responsibility for shooting. And Washington can't ignore it anymore because rail paralysis isn't just a labor story. It's an economic shutdown. President Rutherford B. Hayes gets pulled into it because there's one lever. Only he can pull. Federal troops. That decision carries its own dark logic. In 1877, federal soldiers are still a living memory of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Sending them into American cities to clear tracks is a signal that the government sees the strike not as a workplace dispute, but as a threat to the state itself. And once that signal goes out, the country splits into two fears at the same time. Business leaders fear collapse if the rails don't run. Working neighborhoods fear they're about to be treated like an enemy army. The strike keeps moving anyway, because it isn't one strike. It's a chain reaction of local crises that all look the same. A yard jammed, a crowd formed, a militia ordered in, shots fired or barely avoided, rail property attacked, and the city waking up the next morning unsure who's in control. And then comes the moment that scares the establishment most, because it's bigger than trains. In some places, the stoppage starts pulling in other workers, dock hands, factory crews, teamsters, men who realize the railroads aren't just one employer among many. They're the spine. If the spine locks up, everything else can push back at once. That's the point where the railroad strike stops being railroad men versus railroad owners and starts looking like a national fight over whether industrial America can be shut down from the ground up. The strike didn't need a headquarters to keep spreading. It only needed the rails to stay stopped long enough for cities to panic. In some places, that panic turned into something bigger than railroad men. St. Louis became the clearest example. Rail traffic froze, and suddenly the stoppage pulled in other workers who depended on the same network: dock hands, warehouse crews, factory men. The city started acting like one body, trying to choke the spine of the economy. What made St. Louis terrifying to executives wasn't the shouting. It was the organization that appeared almost overnight. Local labor activists and working-class committees began coordinating which lines could run and which could not. They weren't negotiating wage tables. They were deciding whether commerce moved at all. If Pittsburgh was rage, St. Louis was control. And that looked, to the country's leadership, like the first step toward an insurrection. Back east, railroad presidents read the same reports and reached the same conclusion. If this turns into a rolling general strike, the railroads don't just lose profits. They lose authority. That's why the response tightened into one national pattern. Rail executives demanded protection of property and movement of trains. Governors asked for more force than their militia could supply. And President Rutherford B. Hayes faced the decision every leader hates. Do you send federal soldiers into American cities to break a strike? Hayes chose the rails. Once that choice was made, the strike entered its next phase. Not negotiation, containment. In Pennsylvania, Governor John F. Hartranft had already seen what happened when troops fired into a crowd, and the crowd burned the yards anyway. He wanted control restored fast, before Pittsburgh's example became a blueprint. In Maryland and West Virginia, the same problem kept repeating. Local units hesitated, and the railroads demanded troops who would not. Federal soldiers arriving didn't solve the underlying anger. They changed what anger could do. A crowd can stop a train. A crowd can overwhelm a small militia. A crowd struggles when the government treats a rail yard like a military post. In St. Louis, the pressure campaign began to break under that reality. In other cities, the same thing happened in different ways. Troops guarded bridges. Troops guarded yards. Troops cleared lines. The goal wasn't to win hearts. It was to restart the network. By late July, the strike was still dangerous, but the window was closing. Hunger doesn't wait. Strike funds were thin. Arrests mounted. And the moment trains began rolling in some places, the psychological spell broke in others. The national shutdown started to look less inevitable. Still, the violence didn't end cleanly. Rail property had burned. People had died. And the country had watched, in less than 2 weeks, an industrial pay cut turn into a national crisis. The last question was simple, and it was brutal. If the railroads could trigger this with wages, what happens next time they do it again? When the federal troops moved, the strike didn't end. It narrowed. Soldiers didn't solve a wage cut. They cleared tracks. They guarded bridges. They reopened yards like they were military depots. In city after city, the same scene repeated. Rifles at the switches, bayonets at the roundhouse doors, and freight cars finally rolling past crowds that were too exhausted to stop them again. President Rutherford B. Hayes took the political risk and used the one tool that could override a collapsing patchwork of state responses. The railroads wanted certainty. Governors wanted the problem off their hands. Washington gave them an answer that felt like a warning to everyone watching. The rail network would run, even if a city had to be occupied to make it happen. For the railroad presidents, it worked. For the country, it left a scar. By the time the smoke settled, the strike's violence had a national tally that people still argue over because the chaos moved faster than clean record-keeping. Estimates commonly land around 100 dead across the country, with thousands arrested and enormous property loss in burned cars, yards, and depots. The railroads mostly held their line. Many wage cuts remained. The men who stopped the trains learned what it meant to fight the spine of the economy without a seat at the table. And the cities learned a different lesson. Pittsburgh's burned yards weren't treated like a one-off disaster. They were treated like a rehearsal for the next time. In the years after 1877, urban centers started building armories and reorganizing their guard forces, not as decoration, but as an admission. If workers ever shut the rails again, the response would be faster, heavier, and more coordinated. That's how the railroads pushed America into chaos and changed it afterward. Not only through the violence, but through the new machinery that violence justified. For workers, the strike became a story told in hard terms. You can stop the trains. You can scare the nation. But if you don't have a recognized structure, a strike can be isolated, criminalized, and broken city by city. In the years that followed, labor organizing grew sharper and more organized, because 1877 proved spontaneous rage could ignite the country, but it couldn't hold it. For the railroads, the message was just as clear. They had won the weak, but they had revealed a weakness nobody could unsee. A railroad empire is only an empire while men agree to move the steel. So here's the ending image. Not the flames, not the gunfire. A freight train leaving a yard under guard. The same track, the same timetable, the same iron rhythm returning. And in the background, a city quietly pouring concrete for an armory, because everyone now knows what happens when the rails stop. Like the video, subscribe, and comment, where are you watching from? This community follows the real pressure points that made America shake. If you watched the video to the end, would you have stood on those tracks?